Hey, Malcolm, you know that Audible's got a lot more than audiobooks?
Of course, podcasts,
Originals,
bestsellers,
future bestsellers,
sleep stories.
sleep story. What are you talking about, sleep story? Malcolm. Oh, wow. Malcolm. Malcolm. Hey, no, Roxy. Hey, Roxy, get out of Malcolm's house.
The most inspiring minds, the most compelling stories, all in one place. Audible.
Hello there. I'm Sandy Banks, and I'm a columnist here at the Los Angeles Times, and I'm your host for today's panel. Thank you very much for tuning in today to our 26th annual Festival of Books and our virtual event, Criminal Justice in America. I think there's no better time to talk about this, and I'm really pleased to have such great panelists on with me today. We're going to be joined first by Emily Bazel. She was the winner of the 2019 LA Times Book Prize in Current Interest for her book, Charged, The New Movement to Transform American Prosecution and End Mass Incarceration. Emily is a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine and a Truman Capote Fellow for Creative Writing and Law, and a lecturer at Yale Law School. Next, we have Brittany K Barnett. She's the 2020 LA Times book finalist in Current Interest for her book, A Knock at Midnight, a story of hope, justice, and freedom. She's an award-winning attorney and entrepreneur who is focused on social impact investing. And finally, we have Christine Montross. She was also a 2020 finalist in Current Interest for Waiting for an Echo, The Madness of American Incarceration. She's an associate professor of psychiatry and human behavior at the Warren Alpert Medical School at Brown University, and she's a practicing inpatient psychiatrist. All of these books will be available at Vroman's Bookstore with signed book plates, and I hope that you will patronize our independent bookstores because they're critical to our mission and to your happiness and livelihood. Emily, Brittany, and Christine, welcome. I'm going to start with some questions so the authors can talk to you about their books and their orientation, and then we're going to have questions from the audience. Brittany, let's start with you because all of these books are about criminal justice reform, and yours kind of encompasses everything from suspicion, arrest, trials, convictions, and incarceration. And you're also somebody who kind of had a foot in both worlds. You wrote this because of your personal experiences. Can you tell us, briefly about what led you to this and what you learned?
Yeah, I grew up in rural East Texas and had a mother who suffered from drug addiction. And that ultimately led to her going to prison. And so experiencing the incarceration of my mother gave me a firsthand experience about the devastation caused by mass incarceration, the devastation it causes families and entire communities. When one person goes to prison, the entire family goes to prison. And that personal experience for me really guides my work in this space, for sure, to really center the human element.
Were you shocked by what you saw in your mother's case and what you learned as you went through the process?
Absolutely. My mother needed treatment, not prison. My mother had a very severe addiction to drugs. And I saw, in lieu of rehabilitation and treatment, I saw my mother being sentenced to 8 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And even though I wasn't in law school at the time, I knew something was very wrong with that situation. I'm very blessed. My mother's very blessed that during the 2.5 years she spent in prison, she became sober, and really uses her life now as a light for others. But I am very adamant, when I say that my mother became sober despite a prison, not because of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that we really need to take a deep look at incarceration, and especially as it intertwines with addiction and poverty.
Mm-hmm. Christine, you looked specifically at incarceration involving people with mental illness. And it was shocking to see both the conditions they lived in and the way they got there. You'd been practicing inpatient psychiatry, so you were familiar with the problems, but there is a sense of you being really shocked by what you saw as you spent time in the prisons. Can you tell us a little about, the mental health services or lack of services that you saw and why these people were in there?
Sure. So you're correct that I work as a psychiatrist in an inpatient psychiatric hospital. I work on the intensive treatment units of this hospital, which are like the psychiatric version of the ICU. And what I have seen over and over again over the course of my practice is how frequently my patients come into contact with police and often serve time in jails and prisons. And this is very frequently not due to any kind of criminal intent, but often as a result of their symptomatology. So people who are shouting in the Starbucks at their voices or charging through TSA because they have a delusional belief that they need to get on a plane. And in these moments, police are called. And then in the moment of the police encounter, the decision is made whether they go to a place of treatment or a place of punishment. So I think what shocked me the most once I started going into these places of punishment was first and foremost how indistinguishable the people that I was seeing in the therapeutic environment were from the people in the punitive environment. So people were just as ill in the prisons as they were in my hospital. But then how difficult it was for people with severe psychiatric illness to comply with the expectations in prison, where there's a very set of parameters. You have to behave, you have to comply, and if you don't, you get further punishment. And when someone is hearing voices, seeing visions, profoundly suicidal or depressed, they're not always able to comply. So they would ratchet up punishment after punishment, and that seemed quite unjust to me.
We're having that issue addressed here in Los Angeles because our county jail is considered the biggest mental health institution, maybe in the country. What can be done to, mentally ill people are going to wind up in jail. And what can we do to separate, to treat them? I mean, is that the answer? Is treatment inside of incarceration, or is the answer more alternative treatments outside of jail and prison?
I think the answer is both. I will say, and I think Brittany speaks to this as well, but I think I will say we arrest people sometimes in this country because they do not have adequate treatment. So when people's symptoms are untreated, they often run afoul of our societal expectations. And in those moments, the police are called. Or we see family members who are desperate to get their loved one's treatment, and they have no way to do so other than in a psychiatric emergency to call the police. Unlike in a medical emergency, a car accident, a stroke, a heart attack, in those moments, we send trained emergency medical technicians to intervene, to act, start an IV, stabilize a fracture, stop bleeding, and take someone to a therapeutic environment. We ought to do the same for psychiatrically ill people. And we also need to provide mental health services in our jails and prisons. But I think first the question is, how do we keep mentally ill men and women out of our nation's jails and prisons and more completely in treatment?
Thank you. That is something we're wrestling with here now. And it's hard to get people on the same page. And I hope they all take a look at your book and see what's going on. Emily, you took a really different approach, I thought, and was fascinating because you looked specifically at prosecution and prosecutors and the power that they hold to decide the course of a trial and the fate of a person. And I covered criminal justice for a long time, but I never knew a lot of what you shared. Can you talk about, the role of prosecutors and how they influence the process, and also what you see now with the push toward more progressive district attorneys and more progressive prosecution tactics?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for doing this panel. I'm so glad to be here with Brittany and Christine. So I wanted to highlight the role of prosecutors because I think a lot of people assume that in the American criminal justice system, there's a triangle with a judge on top and the prosecutor and the defense lawyers at the bottom of the two corners of the triangle on an equal playing field. And that's just not really how American criminal justice works anymore, because of the rise of mandatory minimum sentences and the stacking of charges with lots of different violations of the criminal code that starts in the 1980s, you see a vast increase in the amount of power that prosecutors have vis-a-vis judges and certainly vis-a-vis defense lawyers. And what I mean by that is that once you have mandatory minimum sentencing or the stacking of charges, the punishment is really baked into the charging decision, and prosecutors make that decision on their own. And so what the American system sort of transformed into was a system in which the prosecutor, whose main job or one of whose main jobs is to convict people and punish them, becomes the most powerful player in the courtroom, not the judge, who is supposed to be the neutral arbitrator. And so I wanted people to understand that shift and reflect on how that has contributed to mass incarceration in this country. At the same time, you're right, I was also writing about the rise of a movement to elect people who run for district attorney making promises to be progressives. And that is a pretty new phenomenon that has really taken off in a lot of places across the country since 2016, and has recently come to Los Angeles with the election of District Attorney George Gascon. And just to focus a little more on California, it's also come to San Francisco with the election of District Attorney Chesa Boudin. So I was sort of looking at these two dynamics at the same time.
Do you think, it's always been said among district attorneys, you're never going to lose votes for being too tough on crime. And these enhancements were looked at as a way of getting the most dangerous people off the street. Do you think now this progressive movement is going to take hold in a major way that can lead to fundamental change? Because here in Los Angeles, it's very bogged down in fighting between the district attorney and the deputy district attorneys that he is in charge of. And there's lawsuits and there's just a lot of criticism, and they're now marshaling victims to say, we want these people in jail. How do you see, what way forward do you see that could make these reforms a permanent function of our criminal justice system?
Yeah, it's a great question. So whenever you have a big challenge to the status quo, especially when there is a big entrenched bureaucracy that supports that status quo and indeed needs it to perpetuate itself, in those conditions, you're going to have a backlash to anyone who comes in and tries to make major change about anything. And we've seen this in a lot of cities, including Los Angeles, that have elected progressive people making progressive promises as district attorney. Turns out it's one thing to give the prosecutor tons of power if that person is going to use it to incarcerate. But if they start using it to decarcerate, then the other parts of the system are going to start to push back. And I think the question of how that dynamic plays out really depends on the voters. So if the voters stick with people like George Gascon and Chesa Boudin and Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Eric Gonzalez in Brooklyn, and re-elect those people, then over time, those constituencies that are driving these elections are going to prove to be, I think, powerful enough to stand up to the other parts of the bureaucracy, but it's not going to change overnight. And it's always the second best solution to changing state laws, right? Like the cleanest way to decarcerate is to have less punishment written into statutes. The problem is that that requires really statewide reform that so far has been out of reach or really difficult to achieve in a lot of places. And so these are the kind of competing or different levers to decarceration that people across the country who are activists and organizers are trying to pull.
You mentioned that a lot of this is in the hands of the voters, and it's the power of the people that are making these changes. So I want to put this to you all based on the changes that you see that we need. Have you seen a groundswell of support, in the streets, in communities, and a recognition, given all of the social justice attention, a recognition that we need to make change? And do you, for instance, Brittany, I know you talked a lot about the disparities between penalties for crack and powder cocaine and how discriminatory that was. And Christine, you talk about, people who don't even get a chance when they're in prison because they're unruly because of their mental illness. Do you see any of you this becoming a movement that can go forward kind of without fracturing and make fundamental changes, just as the tough on crime movement did in the 80s? I don't sense a lot of optimism here. Do you?
I do. I have hope. I have hope because of the people. I represent people serving life without parole sentences handed down under outdated federal drug laws. My clients like Alice Johnson or Sharonda Jones, who were set to spend the rest of their natural lives in prison. And I think people are really starting to wake up and understand just what that means and how that is really breaking families and locking up untapped potential, that this nation needs to thrive. And just morally and economically, these sentences, the way we punish people in this country, it's both morally and economically unjustifiable. And so I have hope from the people that I represent, the people that I've been privileged to help free, and the way they're living their lives and the way they're reaching back to ensure that they are centered and justice impacted people are at the forefront of any movement and any work surrounding them. And because they're taking the forefront and starting to lead us in these efforts, I'm very hopeful. I think doing this work, and I think Emily and Christine could probably agree, we have to hold on to some semblance of hope. Otherwise, I just don't know where we would be mentally and emotionally.
I do agree.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I do agree. And I think just to back up what Brittany's saying, when I looked at polling around criminal justice reform for my book, I was struck by it is majority view that we have too many people in prison in this country and that the system is not fair enough and that we could have fewer people in prison and maintain public safety. And that represents the view of a majority of Republicans as well as Democrats, because I think there is a sense that our return on investment, to use a kind of business term, for prison is terrible because so many people recycle back into prison. That means that it's not helping people become more productive citizens. And so I think there is actually a lot of support for what Brittany's saying. And the question is how loud and clear politicians hear that message. Do people actually make this a priority when they're in the voting booth? Do they ask questions about it? Do they push it to the front of the political agenda?
Yeah, I agree.
Is there advice, and then Christine, I want to ask, but is there advice for people in that groundswell of support that what they ought to be doing more of to, mobilize and to get these views to guide legislation as opposed to the old views? Should we be doing more, or can we do more as just regular citizens?
Well, it's certainly regular citizens in the voting booth, right? So I think part of the power of tough on crime really gets reduced when tough on crime candidates are no longer finding that message is particularly successful for them. I think, I find hope in three major fronts. One of them is exactly what Emily is saying, which is that in an era where there's hardly any bipartisanship, there is actually bipartisan consensus that the correctional system is broken. And so you see at a conference, Newt Gingrich and Cory Booker together on stage addressing some of these issues. So I think that should give us a great deal of hope that both sides indeed see exactly what Emily is saying, that our return on investment is poor. I think there's a lot of hope in the groundswell around policing right now. People with severe mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by police. So I think starting to ask questions, as we're doing as a society, about our policing is inherently tied to corrections. And I have a lot of hope that we're calling attention to that in critically important ways. And then I think, oddly, the pandemic has given a moment of empathy for people to really understand what we're doing when we separate people intentionally from their families, from their communities, that those of us who live free lives for the first time have an understanding of how inhumane it feels to be kept from the bedside of a dying loved one, to be kept out of a nursing home where we can no longer see someone who we care about, to not be able to attend the weddings and funerals, to not be able to to see children and grandchildren. And so I think in a very strange way, the pandemic has also allowed for a moment of empathy that I hope can begin to soften the ways that we see, that we call for the treatment of people who are incarcerated, to see that many of the actions that we take are quite inhumane.
That's a great point that I hadn't thought of, and it makes a lot of sense, and that we ought to be kind of personalizing the stories of people that are incarcerated, as Brittany did, and as you did, and as you did too, Emily, as all three of you have done, so that people can see them as human beings and not as criminals or. And people, is there a shame? And I can ask all of you, since you've talked to people, is there a shame among people about speaking out? I've been in prison. I was a drug addict. My son is mentally ill. Is there a stigma that keeps people from stepping up and talking about that?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a stigma that we have to shatter in this country. I think it's a stigma that is unfounded. And because it's there, a lot of people may not want to speak out. I think it also goes beyond the stigma for the person themselves versus, well, because there's a stigma, I am not going to speak out about my addiction or imprisonment because I might lose my job. I might not get a job when I lose this one. I may lose my place to live. These collateral consequences are grave and they're severe. It is definitely beautiful to see people embracing their stories and justice impacted people sharing their stories, though, in a way that shifts the paradigm and shows this is what freedom looks like. My mother has been out of prison for 13 years now. She's doing amazing. She works as a drug recovery nurse. She's on the board of Girls Embracing Mothers, a nonprofit we have for girls with mothers in prison. And people will say to her all the time, "You don't look like you've gone to prison." And she says, "Well, this is what it can look like." And I think we have to continue to shift the narrative, and really show what freedom looks like and shift the narrative away from the stigma that ties to incarceration and in people who've been justice impacted.
Emily, do you think, I've been thinking about the trial now, the Derek Chauvin trial, a lot, and watching when I can tolerate it. Do you think that watching something like this gives us an eye into how the system works, and with its flaws and with its strengths? Or is this just kind of television and we're just waiting to see, the end?
I hope that it gives people insight. I mean, I think the video footage is so shocking. And for me, the definitive nature of the medical testimony, the sort of very strong proof of the fact that Officer Chauvin's actions caused George Floyd's death has been important. And I think perhaps the most important part is that the blue wall of silence that often protects police officers, even when they hurt people, has really broken. And we've seen so many people in the command structure in Minneapolis come forward and say that these actions that Officer Chauvin took were not necessary, were not justified. Now, to be a little more cynical, or at least hesitant to draw conclusions, this is such an extreme case of police violence that maybe you could argue they're just cutting this one person loose. But I do think that admission is part of, or should be part of, a real national reckoning around how police use force. And unfortunately, this terrible death of Dante Wright outside of Minneapolis has shown once again, how unnecessary police stops of automobiles can be and the tragedies that can result. So I really hope that some of that is sinking in. And I think when you look at the polls and you see how many more Americans are concerned about racial justice with law enforcement or the lack thereof, that gives me some sense that these facts are starting to take hold.
How do we, Christine, then apply all of this to people who are mentally ill? I mean, as you said, a significant proportion of people who are shot, killed, manhandled by police are mentally ill. And we had even, a 9-year-old girl pepper sprayed. because her mother called for help with her. How do we change that system? I mean, even George Floyd could have had somebody come talk him in, perhaps, to getting in that car if they understood, I'm claustrophobic, I'm this. How do we? Do we need teams of psychiatric workers going out? Do we need better training of police officers? They just see a threat and they fire. What do we need to do about that?
So the answer is yes, we need all of that. But I think there are community organizations and local organizations that are doing really good work on this front. So there's, for example, an organization called Cahoots in Oregon, where when a mental health emergency gets called into police, it's a group of clinicians who are trained to go to diffuse that situation, assess what the person needs, and then they have a broad knowledge base of available treatment and can hook the person up with treatment modalities. And what they found is there's been a significant reduction in violence. They have the opportunity to call for police backup should they need to, but they very rarely do. The police are very pleased with that service because it has drastically diminished that drag on their time. So many of the calls that they used to have to go to for those reasons they no longer do. And then it's just an environment where you're less likely to have the situation escalate because these people are trained to really de-escalate moments of crisis. And as I know from my psychiatric training, if you have someone who's very agitated, you want to be quiet, you want to be calm, you want to give them options, you want to side with them, you don't want it to be an adversarial encounter. All of those things are essentially the opposite of what happens often in a police encounter when people are loud, they get cornered, there's compliance is really insisted upon, and so situations can really rapidly escalate. But the responsibility is not just about law enforcement. We also need to really take a close look at hospitals and treatment. I spoke with previous Commander Sarah Westbrook in Portland, Oregon. She told a story about a man at the Portland waterfront who was clearly mentally ill. He had a gallon full of fluid on the end of a chain and he was swinging it above his head and charging at people. People were understandably afraid. They called police. Her officers came to the scene and she described that over the course of a couple hours, without using any kind of force, they eventually got him in their police car, took them to the emergency room. He was assessed, and in Commander Westbrook's terms, he was released from the emergency room before the police paperwork was even done because there were no psychiatric beds available. So we also have a responsibility as a society to really fund treatment and allow people access to treatment so that their only option for treatment isn't jail, because this man was returned to the waterfront, police were called again, and this time when they came, they took him to jail.
Those police officers must have been trained then in de-escalation techniques or something, and we hear a lot about that. Do you see that going on a lot in departments where they're, being taught specifically how to handle cases that might involve mental illness, or, how to de-escalate a situation?
There are really a range of, there's a real range and spectrum here of police forces that are really, diving into de-escalation, correctional officer training that's really diving into de-escalation, in places that are doing it very little. So I think that it's important for that to happen. I also think it happens in more subtle and more upsetting ways too. So police talk about something called a compassionate arrest, where they see someone who is clearly mentally ill and not obtaining treatment, and they say things like, at least I know if I take them to prison, they'll get 3 hots in a cot and someone will assess their safety. We would never arrest someone to make sure that they got their treatment for their diabetes. We would never arrest someone to make sure they got their chemotherapy. So the idea that we get to the point where the only treatment outcome is jail or prison for mental illness, that returns to this question of stigma and of equal treatment. And I think that's a critically important place for us to look as well.
Equal treatment is kind of at the root of a lot of what all three of you wrote. And Emily, I just want to ask you, you had some really telling cases of individuals going through the process that showed that things are not equal. What do you see as the biggest kind of breach in getting equal treatment in the courtroom and I guess I don't want to say compassionate prosecution, but fair prosecution, where a lot of these prosecutors seem to be trying to make a name for themselves by being as tough as they can. What do we do about that?
Well, I mean, I think that we need to recognize that racial disparities just infect every single step of the criminal justice system. I mean, it was just so striking to me when I was reporting for my book that you can talk about arrest, you can talk about bail, you can talk about pretrial detention, charging, sentencing. At every step of the way, you see people of color, specifically Black people and Latino people, being treated in a harsher manner in a way that is not explained by their conduct. You can't say like, oh, well, they did worse things and that's why this is happening. It really just looks like race is having an independent effect. And I think particularly when you look at arrests and charging for nonviolent crimes, which are so common, right? 80% of the crimes in this country are misdemeanors. So think about marijuana possession, which, some jurisdictions and states have stopped prosecuting, but is still being prosecuted in other parts of the country. You see that the use of drugs is the same across racial categories, but the people who get in trouble, who go to jail or prison for using drugs, marijuana, and also other kinds of drugs, it's much higher numbers for Black people and Hispanic people. And every time I encounter a statistic like that, it just sets me back and makes me think that we have such a long way to go in terms of really addressing the role that race plays in our society. And obviously, there's a way in which race and class are intertwined here, and lots of stereotypes about poor people and questions about how different neighborhoods are policed. I think all of those things are really crucial to address. And we are good at identifying the problem at this point. We can have lots of discussions like this with people who have some expertise, and I think you'd hear a consensus about needing to fix this. But that does not mean the problem is actually being addressed in large parts of the country.
There's a lot of attention to wrongful convictions now, too, and an awareness, I think, in the general public that a lot of people are in prison for something they didn't do. Do you see that as a part of justice systems evolution? And I know some district attorneys are having whole units that just look at old convictions to see if some were possibly wrong. Is that a part of what prosecutors are doing more of now?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, it's crucial. I'm writing a story right now about a man who was recently exonerated in New Orleans. His name is Utica Briley. And the participation of the district attorney who's newly elected in New Orleans, Jason Williams, was fundamental to that wrong being righted, as was the recent election of a new judge, Angel Harris, who ordered Utica Briley's release. And these are, when you encounter one of these cases close up, they're devastating because someone's life has been fundamentally changed for something that they didn't do. And that is a really hard injustice to get your mind around. So I think telling people, reminding people, telling those stories that is a real risk in our system is important. I also think it's important for district attorneys who have these review units looking at past convictions to begin with innocence claims, but not to stop there. Because we also have such a huge problem of disproportionate punishment in this country, where we are keeping people in prison for far longer than any kind of goal of deterrence, of deterring their future crime or other people's future crime, can possibly justify. And so I think that's an important part of the system too, is to think about the people who are in prison for decades and decades for something they did as a far younger person, even though we know that risk levels drop a great deal as people start to age.
Yeah, there is a sense that we're willing to throw away some people who have done bad things and not accept the fact that they, particularly if they were young, they can change, they will change. And what was really kind of scary to me about reading your book was how much difference, and it was the same in yours, Brittany, and yours, Christine, one person can make, either in the prosecution, being determined to get them no matter what the evidence shows. Or Christine, in your story, there was such a difference in the way different prison officials handled people and handled cases and their sensitivities. And Brittany, in yours, it was too. It was clear that there were specific people that were intent on locking up Black people, no matter what it took. So we're the system, I guess. Those individual people are the system. But what is there a cultural change that needs to take place to make them a smaller part of the system? Or are there things, can you protest against acts like that? Can you report people to somewhere? What do we do when we see one person's kind of venom, in interrupting another person's life in these negative ways?
I think there needs to be just a lot more transparency. As I mentioned, the work that I do at the federal level, Emily talked about mandatory minimums, and just the power that prosecutors have. In my book, I tell the story of Chris Young, who endured a level of poverty that no child in America should have to endure. And I think Christine would agree, we have to really examine the trauma that comes with poverty in this country. And with Chris Young, he was 22 years old and ultimately sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison for a federal drug offense under the mandatory minimum laws, where the prosecutor, in his sole discretion, had the power to enhance Chris Young's sentence to the point that the federal judge's hands were tied. In fact, Judge Kevin Sharp spoke out on the bench in reluctance of having to give Chris Young this life sentence. Judge Sharp resigned from the bench, and he actually began working with me on Chris Young's case. And Chris Young served 10 years in prison, and I'm grateful that Chris Young is free today. He was just released in January of 2021. But the fact that the prosecutor in the case had more power than the judge, is very telling. This is called an 851 enhancement on the federal level, where prosecutors can enhance your sentence for prior drug convictions. Chris Young's 2 prior drug convictions occurred when he was a teenager. He didn't go to prison for either one. The quantity of drugs in both cases weighed less than 3 pennies. However, we did a lot of research and analyzed a lot of data, and Chris's case was in Tennessee, where this prosecutor was enhancing sentences at a rate second to none to any other prosecutor in the district. I'm in Dallas, the Northern District of Texas, where prosecutors very seldom enhance sentences under the 851 statute. And so I think we have to do a lot more work to be more transparent to identify the perpetrators of these lengthy sentences. I think that so many prosecutors are going without having to have any sense of accountability or responsibility for literally taking someone's life. You have the prosecutor in Chris Young's case literally serving as a prosecutor, a judge, and executioner, because Chris Young was set to die in prison for drugs. And I think that is part of a way that we have to shift this. Emily and Christine both talked about ROI and return on investment. And I come from the corporate world. I was a corporate lawyer for many years, and this country invests over $80 billion a year that we know of on incarceration. But it's so telling to me just how the deeper we dug into data of who these prosecutors are, the less transparent the data was. And as a corporate lawyer, we would never invest $80 billion in any institution or company and not follow and track the outcomes and hold people responsible and accountable. And I think it definitely ties into Emily's book, which is amazing, on just how we have to hold prosecutors accountable in this country. And to do that, I think we have to be a lot more transparent about what's happening so that people know and the public understands.
That's a powerful story. And it's also encouraging that the judge kind of took a stand and said, this isn't fair and I can't do this. But then it's also sad that then we lose a judge who has a moral compass. But that's a great story. Christine, tell me, is there a case that you saw? There were some that moved me so that I had to close the book and stop reading. But was there a case that you saw that made you think your message is something that needs to be said and something that sticks with you?
I mean, I suspect I speak for all three of us when I say that the numbers of people that you see in the system that make you feel like this message needs to get out there are so enormous. I think for me, as a parent, going into juvenile correction facilities was particularly striking. And again, thinking about this moment of the pandemic when parents are so concerned about social isolation of their children, they're so concerned about what kids are missing out on, being deprived of normal school, normal social peer interaction, connection with important teachers and grandparents. And again, thinking that we intentionally do this to children when we incarcerate them is particularly poignant for me. I think one of the most haunting moments for me in researching and writing my book was going through a juvenile correction facility. And the correctional officer was taking us around to look at the living conditions where these boys ages 14 to 20 lived. And we passed by the cell of one young man who was standing on his toilet talking to the ceiling. And as a psychiatrist, this doesn't faze me, right? So I immediately kind of chalked it up to mental illness. I thought that this boy was perhaps talking to voices or visions. And then we continued down the hallway, and I saw another boy in another cell doing the exact same thing. And I said to the correctional officer, "Why are they standing on their toilets?" And he said, "It's a real problem. They've figured out that they can talk to each other through the vents, and they get up on their toilets and have whole conversations this way." And I thought, this is a moment where normal children are trying so desperately in an abnormal environment to be normal children. They're reaching out to each other. They're trying in a moment of real desperation and deprivation to connect, to do something healthy and correct and typical for their teenage years. And in the system, that's seen as a problem. So I think that was quite a haunting moment for me and made me realize that not only are my mentally ill patients damaged when they go into these environments, but people who were previously psychologically healthy and mentally well are damaged by these environments as well. So particularly when you're thinking about children and the neurodevelopment that happens in those ages, I asked someone at that prison, what's the most severe punishment a boy here can receive? And they said they can be sent to solitary confinement for a year. Knowing what I do about neurodevelopment and how critical social interaction is and sensory flooding and responsibility and making choices and decisions, and then thinking about someone being separated from all of that entirely made it really clear that we're not just in a holding pattern in corrections, we're actually damaging people very deeply.
That brings up the pandemic issue that you raised too, now we've been isolated for a year and parents are very upset about their children not seeing friends and all that. But then you imagine someone being in solitary confinement in a bare room for a year, and that's horrific. We have questions from readers, and from viewers. One of them from Mary Ann has to do with what you're talking about. She asks, how can we as the general public advocate for mental health services for the prison population? So Christine.
So certainly asking these questions of your legislators, and I think being really aware of how funding cuts are being made. So funding cuts in general to mental health services are really being slashed, and then funding for all kinds of programming, and Brittany can speak about this as well, but funding for all kinds of programming in prisons and jails are really being cut as well. That disserves us mightily when we think that 95% of the people who are in our nation's jails and prisons come back to our communities. So it would serve us very well to have them using the time that they're incarcerated to be getting job skills training or education or anger management or substance abuse treatment. But we're cutting the funding for all of these things. So I think very careful attention to where the money goes, and then asking those questions and supporting people who are really making common sense decisions about these things is a really good place to start. There are also loads of volunteer opportunities. I, in fact, jotted down when Brittany said Girls Embracing Mothers. I'm always looking for good organizations to support. So there are lots and lots of local organizations where you can do things that help mitigate the mental health effects of incarceration on people. There are ways to contribute books. There are ways to help get kids to visit their parents who are incarcerated. All kinds of community organizations available too. So people who are so inspired can volunteer, and that's always an incredibly welcome thing as well.
And are those things that would just come up if we Google searched, how to volunteer? Okay, good. That's good to know. Along those lines, Brittany, a question for you too. John, one of our viewers, asks, what programs, either existing or new, are available to released prisoners to help restart their lives and reintegrate them into society? Did you see some of your people that you were working with go through programs, Brittany, and what do you think?
Yeah, there are some really great programs out there. Quite frankly, I am often underwhelmed at the programs that exist. I think there needs to be a shift in reallocation of funding to ensure that more robust reentry programs are there. But there are really great ones, such as the Last Mile out in California that actually goes into prisons and teaches people in prison coding skills and assists them with getting employment upon release. There are other organizations that assist with housing and things that are really important to prevent that cycle that Christine just talked about of people going back. It took me some time to write my book. And as I was writing it, it gave me a chance to really reflect. And I realized that some of the most brilliant people I've ever met in my life have been some of my clients. And I understand that we can't keep rescuing people from prison and restoring them to poverty. So I've been just sitting with this vision of how do we create sustainable liberation for justice impacted people that includes economic liberation and equity and being able to ensure that people are put in positions to thrive and not just merely survive. And as I go through this contemplation and think of ways to get involved, I'm really drawn to this area of being able to fund justice impacted entrepreneurs. And so that's some of the work that I've been doing as of late is helping to provide startup costs for justice impacted entrepreneurs to really, unleash their entrepreneurial spirits and have a ripple effect. We have to change the laws in this country. As Emily mentioned, that takes years and decades to even get a consensus to do so. But we can also create systemic change in a different way. Systemic change does not always have to come from Capitol Hill or state legislators. The people that we are working to help free are going to create systemic change in the way they live their lives and in the way they engage with others. And so there are some programs out there definitely that are doing the work to uplift justice impacted people in a way that they can truly thrive and contribute to society. And so the most meaningful ones that I see are the programs that do give people a chance to be economically liberated as well.
Thank you. And then Emily, this one I think is for you, and it has to do with jury trials. And I think, because so much of our attention right now is focused on Minneapolis, people are wondering what's going to happen. And Michelle says in her question that forcing people to be on juries doesn't work. The smarter people always know what to say to get off. And people who don't want to be there just give quick verdicts just so they're able to go home. Isn't there a better way to get juries rather than fear and coercion? And that speaks to kind of the role of juries, a very important role of juries. And you've done a lot of courtroom work, Emily. So what do you think? Is our jury system, our jury empanelment process, is that in need of change?
Yeah, that's a good question. The first thing I want to say is that jury trials are incredibly rare in the United States. It's, we focus on them because they are really important symbolically and because they are riveting, right? Both in real life and in the movies. They're a really important narrative element, but only something like 2% of convictions in the United States are obtained through juries. So I just want to put that out there so that we have some kind of context. My own sense of how people get chosen for juries is that if they don't want to serve and they're clear about their reasons, they are let go. So I'm sort of surprised to see fear and coercion mentioned in this context as a real issue with juries. I think what is important is for people from all walks of life to be willing to serve in them. Often people who are busy, understandably, are reluctant to give up their time, but it really is an important part of American citizenship. And I also, while we're talking about this, I want to sort of piggyback onto what Brittany was just saying about she made such an important point that systemic change does not always have to come through Congress or even the state legislature, which can seem kind of remote and far away. There are a lot of things we can do individually. And I am thinking right now about people who are involved in volunteering in reentry programs or in programs where people visit prison, or even people who just take up pen pal relationships with people who are incarcerated. That can be a really important way to make a difference in someone's lives. I mean, a lot of people, especially if they have long sentences, it can be really hard on their families to keep supporting them. And so if you have energy for being in touch with someone personally, there are programs across the country like Mothers of Incarcerated Sons. It's called MISS, if you want to Google it, that can connect you to individual prisoners. And I've seen that make a huge difference in people's lives.
All right. Well, we're getting, I guess, close to our timeout. And the last question that's been selected isn't exactly criminal justice, but it's a broad sense of basically justice. And it is, and I'd like you all to answer this. It's from Callie. And Callie wants to know, if you could sit down with the white supremacist and try to change his mind, or her mind, what would you do or say? So I'm going to choose Christine to go first, since you know how to talk to people who are delusional. So
right. When I talk to delusional people, I'll take that as a lead-in. Oftentimes I will really see the fear underneath. So if someone believes that I am poisoning their medication, or that the government is watching them, that what they are saying may not be the truth, but it's very clear that the fear underneath is quite real. So sometimes I think the hardest thing in these situations, especially when someone has an abhorrent view like that one, is to listen before we start talking. That's really, really hard when you're hearing someone say things that are so deeply offensive. But I think trying to get beyond the content of what is being said and try to see the emotion of what's being said and speaking to that can sometimes be the most effective way forward in moments like that. I also think, just to return a little bit to what Emily was saying, sometimes people can be persuaded by understanding clear examples of injustices. So, for example, when Emily's saying, Black and brown people are incarcerated at a higher rate than white people, pointing out that that's not due to behavior, but really laying out circumstances where you can show that the behavior is the same, the treatment is different. I think even if that doesn't penetrate through someone's white supremacy, it's nonetheless important to say. I also think, and this actually returns to something that was said earlier in terms of overtly bad or nefarious prosecutors. I think we also have to acknowledge that this is not just, especially in corrections, an issue of with overt white supremacy, but that there is this systemic piece that is true, that is maybe not so overt. And so acknowledging that many of us have biases that play in here. I'm thinking about a study out of Stanford where they were given identical information about a Supreme Court case, and they just changed one word. They described a 14-year-old boy with 17 prior juvenile convictions who was white. They described the same boy, same crimes, who was Black, and the 700 white subjects overwhelmingly endorsed more severe punishment for the boy who was described as Black than white. 700 people were probably not all people we would think of as white supremacists, but that overwhelmingly came through. So I think it's not just about the person who speaks their white supremacy, but also acknowledging that those kinds of opinions can exist in a broad base of people, and starting there is important too.
That's a great answer. I want to tweak that question a bit now, then, based on thinking about what you said. Is it important for us to convince people that structural racism exists and that the system is tilted toward, favoring whites? It's a white supremacist system, kind of. Is that an important part, a necessary part of ultimately reforming the criminal justice system?
Not for me. it's not my work at all. And I think that, I'm fighting white supremacy every single day, that I'm working to prepare motions to save someone's life that is set to die in prison. I have clients who sold drugs. There's no doubt about that. This is not the argument here, but the fact that they're serving the same amount of time in prison as the Unabomber, I think it is beyond legitimate debate at this point that this nation's criminal legal system bleeds with racial injustice. And I think everyone has their own roles to play, in this movement to transform the system. And it's not my work to convince the white supremacists about racism in this country.
Thank you.
I love the frankness of that, Brittany. It's so interesting. So I am of two minds about this. I mean, I think that facts are really important. And the fact that we have such grave racial disparities in the criminal justice system is important for people to understand because it's true. And it informs so many of the sentences of people like the people who Brittany represents. I also think, though, that when we frame injustice only in racial terms, that sometimes we lose people. Often we lose white people, right, who can see that there are also class issues that are factoring into these decisions, or who are just more likely to be moved if they are not being asked to think in purely racial terms because of the kinds of underlying biases that Christine was describing a minute ago. So I'm sort of torn here by wanting people to understand the reality of the American present and how it ties to American history, and worrying sometimes that if we only focus on that, we lose potential political support for making these vital changes, which really cannot wait until white people figure out racism in America.
Wow, thank you. This is great. I think we're getting to our end. But you were pretty much a perfect panel with your perspectives. I think I learned a lot, and I thought I knew a lot already. Is there, well, I don't know, we probably don't even have time for one last message, but I want to thank you all. And on behalf of our viewers, I want to remind you again, there's Charged, A Knock at Midnight, Waiting for an Echo. They're available at Froman's bookstore with signed book plates. And so I hope that when you all rush out to get them, that's where you will go. And I just want to thank Emily, Brittany, and Christine for joining our conversation today. I think we all learned a lot. And thank you, viewers, for joining our panel. You can reach them on Twitter. Their handles are posted, under their IDs on the site. And we hope to see you back. We have a great lineup of author panels going on, and I hope to see you back to some of those. And thank you all very much.
Thanks so much, Sandy.
Thank you.
Thank you.